A quorum of 6 members, including Teachta Dála Awan, Agus Canador Awan. We will start the meeting. We are in public session. The camera's reflecting that. Okay, I want to remind members to turn off their mobile phones. It interferes with the microphone and sound system, therefore we are not. It's very difficult for broadcast proceedings if that continues. Our meeting has been convened to discuss pre-legislative scrutiny of the housing regulation of approved Housing Bodies Bill 2015 and related matters. The heads of the bill and other documents are available on the committee website, and members of the public are welcome to make comments. The committee is also meeting stakeholders today and next week, that's the 15th of December. It is proposed that if not previously concluded, this session will be brought to a conclusion at 3:30. Is that agreed? I would like to welcome the following witnesses to the meeting: Ms. Rosalind Carroll, Head of Regulation, and Sophie Geraghty from the Housing Agency, and from the Housing Finance Agency, Mr. Barry O'Leary, Chief Executive Officer, and Sean Crimmon, Head of Treasury. I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. It is proposed that the opening statements and any further documentation you supply may be published on the committee website after the meeting. Is that agreed? I now call on Ms. Rosalind Carroll to make her opening statement to the meeting.
Chairman and committee members, I welcome and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you regarding the housing regulation of approved Housing Bodies Bill 2015. I'm joined by my colleague Sophie Geraghty, Financial Regulation Manager in the Regulation Office of the Housing Agency. The Regulation Office was established as the interim regulator for approved housing bodies, otherwise known as AHBs, in February 2014. And our purpose is to implement the voluntary regulatory code for AHBs and to introduce a system of regulation pending legislation and a statutory framework. The Regulation Office reports to an interim regulatory committee of non-executive members. The committee appointed by the Minister for Housing and Planning is a committee under the board of the Housing Agency but has independent decision-making powers. And our specific brief is to implement the voluntary regulatory code for approved housing bodies, to assess AHBs in respect of their financial viability, their governance, performance management and their overall compliance with the code, to further develop the voluntary regulatory framework and to advise and support the development of a statutory regulatory framework. There are over 500 AHBs, also commonly referred to as housing associations or cooperatives, providing over 30,000 homes across the country presently. The sector is very diverse in terms of activity and size, ranging from small voluntary-led community-based organisations to large-scale national organisations, although most of the stock is held by a small number of large AHBs. The sector has developed steadily over the last 20 to 30 years in what was up until recently a low-risk environment. However, the financing and delivery of social housing has been changing over the last number of years. The sector is becoming less reliant on capital grants from the government and increasingly borrowing finance to support the development of social housing. AHBs are now a central part of the government's vision for social housing, and regulation is vital to ensure that the enhanced role of AHBs is managed effectively, that existing assets are safeguarded, and that the tenants of existing and future social homes are protected at all times. The AHB sector has made a significant contribution to the development of social housing in Ireland. Regulation of the sector, rather than impedes delivery, should enable the further delivery of homes, and is important for a number of reasons. To ensure that the investment made by the state is managed and that homes provided are available for tenants into the future, to build capacity of the sector to deliver more and better quality homes, and to build confidence of public and private funders to invest in the sector through the presence of regulatory oversight. Experience elsewhere has shown that well-designed regulation of AHBs can foster stakeholders' confidence in the sector and create an environment that encourages growth and innovation. The presence of regulatory oversight is critical in building the confidence of lenders to invest in the sector and in building the capacity of the sector to take on new risk. At a practical level, good regulation can also lead to lower lending costs for the sector when lenders are reassured as to the long-term stability and growth potential of the sector. Regulation is also very important in protecting the interests of tenants and ensuring that social landlords are providing good quality services. Since the Regulation Office in the Housing Agency was established, the Office has sought to promote regulation in the sector and develop a framework which allows for robust oversight of the sector, but also for a smooth transition to a statutory-based framework. At this point, some 210 AHBs have signed up to regulation, representing 82% of the overall AHB stock. The Office is confident that at this time we have all of the larger AHBs, that's AHBs with a stock of over 300 homes, signed up, and the numbers of AHBs signing up is continuing to grow on a weekly basis. We have completed our first cycle of assessments and based on an annual regulatory return of 142 AHBs and have now commenced the second cycle of annual assessments in respect of the 2014 year. The Office has been able to engage positively with a number of AHBs where issues have been identified or referred to the Office. An annual report with aggregate data on the sector as a whole was published in July 2015, which gives an overview of what the sector looks like as well as how it is performing against certain criteria, and thus further supports the transparency and accountability of the sector. In conclusion, regulation has a key role to play not just in protecting tenants and safeguarding the public investment in social housing, but in enabling further delivery of social housing. A significant amount of AHBs have already voluntarily signed up and have welcomed regulation. Many AHBs consider it a necessary element of them growing and providing social housing in a new funding environment, but also in the context of them being more transparent and accountable to tenants, the public and the state. There are a number of parallels between the current voluntary regulatory framework and with what is proposed in the bill. The experience gained in implementing the voluntary regulatory framework over the last number of years has informed the design and structure of the bill. The bill underpins many of the principles already established under the voluntary structure, that is, a structure that is proportionate, risk-based and focused on the financial health, governance and performance of AHBs. The bill also provides the necessary legislative powers for a regulator to be able to assess, investigate and intervene where necessary. It enables the regulator to set standards for the sector, which mirrors practice already occurring. Under the interim structure already in place, a financial standard has been developed for the sector, which establishes specific financial requirements for AHBs. The power to transfer assets is also provided for. This is a significant power and one that has rarely been used, if ever, in other jurisdictions, but is necessary to protect assets and ultimately protect tenants where serious issues arise. In an increasingly complex funding and delivery environment, with a growing need for organisations to be more accountable and transparent to their government, investors, statutory-based regulation is welcome. Good regulation supports what AHBs should already be doing from a good business perspective, and voluntary regulation is already operating very successfully.
Thank you indeed. Mr. Barry-O'Leary.
Afternoon, Chairman, members of the committee. I'm pleased to be here today with my colleague Sean Cremin, who's our Head of Treasury, to give a brief outline of what the Housing Finance Agency does and our views on the upcoming legislation. Just a bit of background on the HFA. I don't propose to read through all the opening statement that we've submitted. The HFA's function and mission is to advance loan finance to local authority and approved housing bodies to be used for them for any purposes under the Housing Act. Our role is to supply appropriate funding for schemes and projects decided upon and established by the Minister and the Government. Our total loan outstanding, our loan book outstanding at the 31st of December 2014 was 4.3 billion. Most of the lending that we do is to local authorities. I don't propose to speak about that this afternoon, but rather concentrate on our lending to approved housing bodies. We began this side of our business in 2011. Up until then, the government had largely grant-funded housing bodies for social housing. However, through tighter budgetary constraints, they've introduced a system of loan finance, and the HFA has had to adapt its processes and has quickly become the largest provider of loan finance in this sector. Direct AHB lending creates a different level of risk for the Housing Finance Agency compared to our lending to local authorities, and we manage this risk through a credit assessment process. In order to be considered for loan finance from the HFA, any approved housing body must first apply to us for certified body status, using a standard 3-page application that we use. The suitability criteria that we use are similar to other financial providers, and they broadly look at 3 areas: the entity's past performance, their current corporate governance structure, and their future development and financial plans. To date, the HFA has received applications from 25 approved housing bodies for certified status from ourselves. We have approved 12 of these. We've rejected 11. 1 has been withdrawn and 1 is pending with ourselves at the moment. In the event that an application is rejected, we have a process where we sit and talk to the entity and explain to them the various steps that are required in order to achieve status, and a number of those who have been approved with us have gone through this process and have subsequently been approved on reapplication. Once you've got certified body status from the HFA, you can then apply for loan finance, and 100% of the loan applications that we've received to date have received offers of loan finance from the HFA. We currently have about 500 million available for lending to approved housing bodies. To date, finance for individual housing developments to the value of 180 million has been approved. This will cover the acquisition or development of 1,600 houses and the energy retrofitting of another 550 houses. To date, about 60 million has been advanced, with the balance due to be advanced as the projects progress. The HFA, its credit assessment procedures have been vetted by the European Investment Bank, and they approached us then, having looked at our assessment process, and sought to use the HFA as a conduit to the sector, and they provided us with 150 million worth of loan finance for passing on to the housing sector in January 2015. The value of this finance is that it offers certainty of interest rates, in that we can offer 25-year fixed-rate loans to approved housing bodies at rates around 3.25%, which gives them certainty in terms of their exposure for the remaining period of the loan. In terms of our borrowing, the HFA is currently authorised to finance loans of up to 10 billion. At the moment, we have reserves of 128 million and expect a surplus in our activities this year of 22 million. In terms of the challenges for the future, our main role is to supply suitable finance at the right time and price to finance the social housing strategy, which the Department of Environment is currently operating. We welcome the intent of the legislation, and we think that the establishment of an independent regulator is very important and will lead to significant benefits for the sector. In conclusion, we believe the proper independent regulation will assist in the building of the capacity of the sector, help create certainty and improve investor confidence in the creditworthiness of AHBs. Regulation will provide additional evidence to lenders that the sector is well governed, well managed, and a financially viable organisation are there capable of dealing with loan finance. More importantly, we think it will also deliver benefits to tenants who will enjoy security of financially sound landlords with well-managed properties properly maintained. The development of sectoral standards on issues such as sinking fund provision, risk management and good corporate governance are all important elements of the regulator's work in the years to date. I trust that's a quick bit of detail in terms of the HFA's background and our interaction with approved housing bodies, and we welcome any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. O'Leary. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in groups of questioners together just to save a bit of time. Deputy Dowds, you're the first person in a group of questioners.
Could I welcome our guests? Could I ask you to outline, in terms of approved housing bodies, I mean, what you see is both the advantages and disadvantages. I mean, my suspicion is that one of the disadvantages is that tenants won't be able to purchase, but I'd be interested to hear your views on that. How will HAP operate in terms of these bodies? And if you could say something more about your source of finance. Obviously, a main one is the government, but to what extent do you think you'll be able to get finance from other sources? Also, question, this may not be a fair question for the day, and in which case you can ignore it. But as a public representative, I'm very concerned about the delivery of housing as rapidly as possible. And can you say anything about the extent to which approved housing bodies will be able to assist with that urgent problem? Thank you.
Next question, Senator Cockeen.
Thank you, and very welcome. I suppose housing is the top of the agenda, and you're very welcome here today, and acknowledge the role that you play in ensuring provision of housing is with local authorities in particular, and social housing, and the role you play. What is it, 25 years at funding of 3.25% I suppose. It's good, very good rate that you wouldn't get anywhere else really. So acknowledging that role. You mentioned in your opening statement there, Ms. Carroll, I think it was, that 82% of the housing agencies have signed up. Why isn't it 95%? That's the first question. And the other one, the bill provides that a regulator can intervene where they see necessary to assess the needs on the ground. Maybe you'd elaborate a bit more on where you see at the moment intervention would be necessary to, if you like, speed up the process when we look at the aims and objective of providing the houses on the ground, which are slower coming on the ground, and the role maybe that you could play there. The supply of the appropriate funding to local authorities. There was just one statement there, and say 25 have applied, 12 approved. That's one question. If 25 applied and the need is so great and the conditions have been met, why were only 12 approved out of 25? That's a low rate of approval, I would say. And further down in the statement then, it says 100% of loan approvals have received an offer. Now, is it that they refused an offer or what? Or is it different? Am I looking at two different things? And to date, 180 million for the acquisition development of 1,600 homes. 60 million has been advanced. Could there be faster advancing of that 180 million? Because obviously speed is of the essence, and your job as a loan financing agency and as a regulator, that I think how to get things moving fast should be, and I presume it is, your priority as well as government priority. Thank you.
Deputy Cohen.
Thank you. Join with other speakers welcoming you today, and thank you for your contributions. Two specific questions. First of all, in relation to approved housing bodies, we would like to engender and empower people to aspire where they can to own their own home. There are tenant purchase schemes advanced over many years by different governments, and most recently there's a new one in recent weeks, which is welcome. The same opportunity doesn't exist for those whom are tenants of approved housing bodies, housing associations. And has there been any discussions or any indications or any sign from government to yourselves to explore that possibility when you're dealing with approved housing bodies? That it is definitely an aspiration of many local authorities throughout the country and many councillors to speak to now their own, the tenants who are in those homes, whom would like the opportunity, similar to those in local authority homes, the opportunity to purchase them. Secondly, in relation to the Housing Finance Agency, there's a cohort of people that have been left behind in recent years, and I see it in my own local authority and many others, the elderly, and means and methods to adapt their own homes to meet the requirements that they have in old age through medical and other ailments. And local authorities, access that funding from government based on the amount they can put to it themselves. And in recent years, obviously, they can put nothing to it themselves, therefore there's nothing coming from government. And the waiting lists are just spiralling out of control in some counties. I know in my own county, for example, I'm aware of about 70 or 80 cases that would require in the region of about 15,000, which is about €1 million, 15,000 a home to adapt those homes to meet their requirements and allow them remain in their own home, allow them to remain part of the family, remain part of their community. In the absence of that, they're facing the possibility of going into nursing homes, they're facing the possibility of going into long-stay beds in hospitals and so forth, and waiting 5 years, if they survive those 5 years, for funding to be made available. In the meantime, it costs the state up to 15 million for those 5 years, when $1 million would have sorted it in the short term. So again, I'm asking, has there been any communication from government to explore a means by which the Housing Finance Agency could have a role in addressing that gap that exists? Now, I know you have issues, legal issues in relation to home ownership and whatnot, but I mean, it could be a similar scheme to that of the one where the elderly, can take a stake in that. The state can get back to put a charge in the house. The fair deal scheme, exactly. So something similar along those lines, I think, may be appropriate to meet the demand that's there and address that situation, because, as I said to you, while all the focus, and rightly so, is on the lack of housing, the lack of units, the lack of progress in that regard over the last number of years, that's a cohort that have been left behind, and it's something that we'd like to see explored, and ideas and suggestions emanating from those explorations for government to implement thereafter.
Thank you, Deputy Cohen. I'll now go in the order in which the Speaker started. Rosalind Carroll to begin the replies.
Okay. Thank you. I'll go back to Deputy Dowd's questions in relation to maybe outlining the advantages and disadvantages in the first instance. I suppose just in terms of the advantages, I probably outlined some of them in my opening address there in terms of why do regulation. I think first and foremost it's about the complexity in terms of the world that's changing in terms of how social housing is being delivered. And if AHBs are to have an enhanced role, then we need to be looking at regulating them in a different way. So they're no longer receiving 100% capital finance. Then we need to be able to have regulatory oversight in order that people will invest in them to deliver more housing. But apart from just attracting in lenders, we need to then also think about they're changing how they do business and they're taking on risk. And so to actually protect the tenant, there needs to be regulatory oversight. So it's not just about the private finance, it's actually about ensuring if they are taking on private finance that there's oversight to ensure that that's not too much finance and that the homes that tenants are already in can also be protected. It's also about ensuring that tenants are well governed, well managed, and about the performance. So there will be a role in terms of the role that I carry at the moment. We look at governance and we look at financial viability, but we also look at the overall performance of an organisation. And that could be looking at areas like maintenance, management, vacancies, the vacancy rates across the stock and so on, to check that the housing and the performance is at the level that we would expect it to be. And where there are individual issues then, we would be looking for an explanation of that and what they're doing to address that. So if we saw very high vacancy rates, for instance, that's one of the things that we'd be doing. Ultimately, one of the powers also that's given within the bill is for publishing information. And through publishing information, there should be a transparency there, again for lenders, but also for tenants, and empowering tenants in the future to make choices about who their landlords are, and that they can say that X landlord seems to be doing well and I want to opt for that accommodation over another accommodation. You mentioned the tenants purchase scheme, and it was mentioned later on as well. At the moment, under the way the current funding schemes work, and obviously that's not a matter for regulation, but under the way the current funding schemes work, most of the property that's been funded by the state has a mortgage against it, and that mortgage against it means that they couldn't sell the property. It has to be available for social rented purposes. So any such decision would have to involve the AHB having regard to the mortgage on the property in the first instance and repaying some of the debt to government in terms of the legal entity that exists at the moment. I do know, however, that the incremental purchase scheme that was introduced, I think, back in 2009 under the Housing Act at that time, does allow for incremental purchase arrangements where AHBs could do incremental purchase, and that would allow them to build housing for sale in the first instance for people off the social housing waiting list. So maybe it wouldn't be the exact tenant purchase scheme that you see at the moment, but the new tenant purchase scheme is based on the incremental purchase scheme as well, in terms of it's bought over a period of time. So there may be options for AHBs to do more of that. I am aware of one approved housing body that have worked in conjunction with the local authority to do that on a particular particular site in Drogheda. And so there may be further examples of that could be looked at in the future. But as I said, it's not specific to my role in terms of regulation. You also mentioned HAP, and again, just my only understanding in terms of the difference between HAP and how it would impact on approved housing bodies is, at the moment, some approved housing body tenants receive rent supplement. It's a capped amount of rent supplement, and in time they will receive a HAP payment rather than a rent supplement payment when they're in that accommodation. That's in accommodation that's been financed under the capital assistance scheme.
Therefore, it would be easier for them to go back to work, which is part of the intention of HAP.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's
so there'll be no disadvantage for somebody in under housing.
Yeah, and that piece of the Act hasn't been commenced, but I would imagine it'll be commenced fairly quickly from my understanding of speaking to officials within the department. We've also done a pilot in one particular local authority in Kerry to see how it would actually work. So I would imagine that it will come online fairly quickly. In terms of finance from other sources other than the Housing Finance Agency, there are examples of most of the Irish commercial banks lending to the sector at the moment. I think nearly all of them have lent at some point, and some of them are expanding their business at the moment into that. We also have had some non-Irish banks enter the market and come to us as well in terms of trying to find information, and we've had engagement with the European Investment Bank as well in that front. So I hope that that answers most of your questions.
So will that loan then be paid back from what you got in rents and the like?
Yeah, basically under the model, the way it works is the body, instead of getting a capital payment from the department, what they get is a payment and availability agreement, which is essentially a revenue payment, and that revenue payment is linked to market rent, and it's based on 92% of market rent. So they have that money coming back in, and it's up to them then to try and pay back the loan through that revenue stream that they're getting in. So it's a constant revenue stream rather than an upfront capital payment coming from the state. In terms of, you asked whether delivery of housing is going as rapidly as possible, Mr. O'Leary referred to 60 million or thereabouts in terms of drawdowns so far from the AHP sector. We had last year when we looked at, sorry, for this year,
60 million.
Yeah, that's with regards to the HFA. Now that doesn't take account of other lenders or any input that they would have had themselves into. Some of the bodies will have put in some of their own finance into it. When we looked at the sector last year, we did global accounts in respect of the Tier 3, which are the larger AHBs, that's AHBs with over 300 units. We had 46 million down as what had been drawn down in funding at that time from private finance or loan money. So what we would expect out of regulation being there is a rapid increase in that, so that there's much more of that happening, so that regulation enables more supply of social housing. That is our overall objective, is to enable further supply and protect tenants. So when we launched our annual report, what we want to see going forward is looking to see how much of that is going up over time and how much further delivery of it is. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, we have started in our second cycle of assessments. Out of that, we will do another annual report, and we should be able to show what progress there's been in terms of the overall money that's come in by looking at all the accounts of the bodies, and we should be able to show how much additional output there has been from the sector overall. So we would hope to have that out probably in another 3 or 4 months before we've accumulated all and assessed all the returns that we'll have got in respect to the 2014 year, and we'll be able to tell you about it further at that time. Just to go back to Deputy Keane, you had asked about why do we only have 82% of the stock signed up, and this has been brought up before. I suppose we would say that regulation was only first introduced in February 2014, so in terms of progress, we're quite pleased with the progress that's been made to date. Of the bodies that are out there, there's, as I said, we reckon there's over 500 bodies. So while we have 82% of the stock, there is still a number of bodies if we only have 210 of them signed up. We have all of the Tier 3 bodies with over 300 units signed up. That represents about 80% of the stock. A lot of the smaller bodies have signed up, but there will still be a number of them out there, and we've started to review that. What we think is that a lot of the bodies that have signed up are non-developing bodies, or bodies that may be inactive at this time. So what's happened is sometimes people apply for approved housing status. They may not have ever taken on units, and that they might still have just a status that's attached to them that wouldn't have been reviewed and taken down. Other bodies, because they're not developing, may have just not signed up to take on it. So one of the conditions now, if you want to access state funding from the Department of Environment, is that the funding is prioritised based on sign-up to regulation to the voluntary code as is. So anybody who's accessing new monies is signed up to our code. However, I do think that there is still work for us to do in trying to identify other bodies, and we continue to do that. We're continuing to do newsletters and promote the code as much as possible as we can within the voluntary framework that exists at the moment. In terms of interventions, and I suppose to give you examples, I think that's what you're looking for, when and what is interventions and what's necessary. So to go back to the first cycle of assessments that we did last year, there was 17 bodies that we would have identified out of the 142 where we said further engagement was necessary with them. Now that further engagement could have been very small information where we just required them to clarify a piece of information around their governing, but it could have been because we looked at their accounts and we had seen that they were running at a deficit for 2 years, and we were then worried about that organisation and wanted to find out what they were doing about it. That's a typical example of some of the issues that we would have found. We had found some of those smaller bodies, maybe the Tier 1 bodies, which is units under 50, would be struggling in terms of board membership. So they might have set up 10 or 20 years ago and had the required number of board members, but now they're in a rural community and they only have maybe 2 or 3 board members, and then, in order for good governance, they need to have a full board. Now, we wouldn't be there to criticise them in that. We're actually there to try and support them and see what way can that issue be addressed and how are they looking to address it. But they're the type of issues that are coming up, and we would have had issues that would have been referred to us